Imagine this. Right now, as you're listening to my voice, you might be sitting in the exact position that tripled the stroke risk of every single patient I'm about to tell you about. A Japanese doctor recently sent shockwaves through the medical community with a warning so simple, so specific, that it made me stop and look at my own patients differently. Margaret, 72 years old, a retired librarian from Portland, was sitting exactly this way when she felt the left side of her face go numb, and what she told me next still keeps me up at night. I'm Dr. Michael Harrison, and in my 31 years of medical practice, I've seen everything. I've held the hands of patients taking their last breath. I've celebrated with families when someone walked out of the hospital after we told them they might never walk again. But nothing prepared me for what I started noticing 3 years ago. A pattern so obvious, so startling, that I couldn't believe I had missed it for decades. It all started with Margaret Chen. She came into my office on a Tuesday morning, not because something was wrong, but for her regular checkup. She was the kind of woman who organized her pills in one of those plastic weekly containers, who never missed an appointment, who did everything right, or so we both thought. Margaret sat down in the chair across from my desk, and I remember thinking how elegant she looked. Silver hair pinned back, reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She crossed her legs the way she always did, the same way her mother probably taught her was ladylike 60 years ago. We talked about her blood pressure, which was a little high but manageable. We talked about her grandchildren, 3 of them, all under 10. She showed me pictures on her phone, her eyes lighting up the way only a grandmother's eyes can. And then she said something that made my heart sink into my stomach. "Dr. Harrison," she said, grabbing my hand, "sometimes when I'm reading in my chair at night, my left foot goes completely numb, like it's not even there." I figured it was just my age catching up with me. I asked her to show me how she sits when she reads. She demonstrated right there in my office. Left leg crossed over the right, ankle resting on knee at an angle, leaning slightly to one side. She had been sitting this way for 4 hours every evening for the past 40 years. 4 hours, every single night. And her body had been sending her warning signals that she had been ignoring, thinking it was just part of getting older. What Margaret didn't know, what I didn't fully understand at that moment, was that she was compressing a critical pathway in her body. Think of it like a garden hose. When you fold a garden hose in half and step on the bend, what happens? The water stops flowing. Now imagine that garden hose is carrying blood to your brain. That's exactly what was happening to Margaret every single night while she sat reading mystery novels in her favorite armchair. The Japanese research that changed everything for me came from Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka at Tokyo University Hospital. His team studied over 12,000 adults aged 50 to 85 for 7 years. 7 years of meticulous tracking, monitoring, following up, and what they found was so striking that medical journals around the world started publishing his findings within months. One specific sitting position, the cross-legged position held for extended periods, increased stroke risk by 300% in adults over 50. 300%. That's not a small increase. That's not a maybe you should be careful increase. That's a this could end your life increase. Now I want to pause here and make something clear. What I'm sharing with you today is educational information based on research and my clinical observations. Everyone's body is different. If you have specific health concerns, please discuss them with your own doctor who knows your complete medical history. That said, this information is too important not to share. Let me tell you about Robert Martinez, 68 years old, a retired high school football coach from San Antonio. Robert was the kind of man who prided himself on being tough. He'd spent 40 years on the sidelines in 100-degree Texas heat, never complaining, never showing weakness. When he came to see me, it was because his wife Patricia made him. She'd noticed that his left hand would sometimes shake when he was eating dinner, and she wasn't going to let it go. Robert sat in my examination room the same way he'd sat in his office watching game film for 4 decades, legs crossed, right ankle over left knee, leaning back like he was about to break down a defensive formation. When I asked him how long he sat this way each day, he laughed. "Doc," he said with that Texas drawl, "I've been sitting like this since I was 25 years old. You're not going to tell me now that it's bad for me, are you?" I didn't have to tell him. His body was already telling him. That tremor in his hand, the numbness he admitted he sometimes felt in his toes, the headaches that had become more frequent over the past year, these were all warning signs. Little alarm bells that his body was ringing, hoping someone would listen. Robert told me something else that day, something that made me realize how deeply these habits get passed down through families. His father had sat the same way, cross-legged in his recliner every evening, watching whatever game was on television, and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Martinez men, all sitting the exact same way, all thinking it was just how a man relaxes. His father had a stroke at 71. His grandfather at 68. Robert had always assumed it was just bad genetics, just the Martinez curse. Now I had to tell him it might have been something far simpler and far more preventable. Here's what happens when you cross your legs the wrong way for too long. Your popliteal artery, which runs behind your knee, gets compressed. It's like putting a kink in the main water line to your house. The pressure builds up on one side, and the other side doesn't get what it needs. Now your body is incredibly smart. It tries to compensate. It increases blood pressure to push through the obstruction. Your heart works harder. Your blood vessels strain. And over time, something has to give. Dr. Tanaka's research showed that this constant compression and release cycle, this daily damage and attempted repair, creates microscopic damage to the blood vessel walls. It's like bending a paperclip back and forth, back and forth. Eventually it snaps. Except in your body, that snap can happen in your brain, and when it does, we call it a stroke. I think about Dorothy Williams every single day. She was 61 years old when she first came to see me, a retired schoolteacher from a small town in Ohio who had moved to be closer to her daughter. Dorothy was a quilter. She spent hours every day in her sewing room, creating beautiful patterns, making blankets for her grandchildren, for church fundraisers, for anyone who needed warmth. She would sit in her sewing chair, legs crossed beneath her, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours without getting up. "Dr. Harrison," she said to me during one of our early appointments, with tears in her eyes, "I keep dropping my scissors. My right hand just lets go sometimes, and I can't figure out why. It's like my brain tells my hand to hold on, but my hand doesn't listen." Dorothy was describing something called transient ischemic attacks, which we sometimes call mini-strokes, little previews of what could come if nothing changes. Her brain was sending signals, but the pathways were compromised, the messages weren't getting through clearly, and every time she sat in that sewing room, legs twisted beneath her, she was making it worse. What broke my heart about Dorothy was what she told me next. She was working on a special quilt for her youngest granddaughter, Emma, who was about to graduate from high school. Every single patch on that quilt represented a memory they had shared together. Beach trips when Emma was little, birthday parties with too much frosting, quiet afternoons reading stories on the porch swing. Dorothy had been working on this quilt for 2 years, and she was terrified she wouldn't be able to finish it. Not because she was running out of time before graduation, but because her hands wouldn't cooperate anymore. Think of your circulatory system like a river. The blood flows from your heart down through your body and back up again, carrying oxygen, nutrients, everything your cells need to survive. Now imagine someone builds a dam partway down that river. The water backs up, pressure builds, some water finds its way around, but it takes longer, and the flow is weaker on the other side. The areas downstream start to suffer. Plants wilt, fish struggle, the whole ecosystem starts to fail. That's what happens when you compress those critical vessels behind your knee for hours at a time. The areas downstream, including your feet, your lower legs, and most importantly your brain, don't get what they need, and the areas upstream have to work overtime to try to compensate. Here's another way to picture it. Imagine you're trying to water your garden with a hose, but someone keeps stepping on the middle of the hose. You can still get some water to the flowers at the far end of the yard, but you have to crank up the pressure at the faucet. You're working harder, the hose is under more strain, and eventually something's going to give. Either the connection at the faucet fails, or the hose develops a weak spot and bursts. That's your cardiovascular system when you sit with crossed legs for hours, every single day, week after week, year after year. Walter Thompson was my wake-up call, 74 years old, veteran of the Korean War, grandfather of 7, deacon at his church for 30 years. Walter was the healthiest patient I had. He walked 2 miles every morning. He ate vegetables from his own garden. He hadn't touched a cigarette since 1968. By every measure we typically look at, Walter should have lived to be 100. But Walter had a habit. Every evening, after his walk and his dinner and his Bible reading, he would sit in his recliner and watch the news. Legs crossed at the knee, left over right, just the way his father used to sit, just the way his grandfather used to sit. It was a family tradition, passed down through generations like an heirloom that nobody questioned. Walter had his stroke on a Thursday evening, right there in his recliner. His wife found him when she came in to ask if he wanted tea. The left side of his face was drooping. He couldn't lift his left arm. The words coming out of his mouth didn't make sense. She called the ambulance immediately, and they got him to the hospital within the golden hour. Walter survived, but he lost the use of his left hand, the hand he used to hold his wife's hand at church, the hand he used to pat his grandchildren on the head, the hand that had served his country and his community for 7 decades. When I visited Walter in the hospital, he looked at me with those clear blue eyes, and he asked me a question I'll never forget. "Doc," he said, his voice slurred but determined, "could I have prevented this?" And I had to tell him the truth. "Yes, Walter, I think maybe you could have." Walter's wife, Eleanor, was sitting in the corner of that hospital room. She hadn't left his side for 3 days straight. When she heard my answer, she put her head in her hands and wept. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet, exhausted tears of a woman who had just learned that the worst moment of her life might have been completely avoidable. That conversation changed the direction of my entire practice. I started asking every patient over 50 about their sitting habits. I started paying attention to how they sat in my waiting room, in my examination room, in their own homes when I made house calls, and what I discovered was alarming. Almost every single one of them had developed the same dangerous habit over decades of life. They crossed their legs without thinking about it, held the position for hours, and had no idea they were slowly, steadily increasing their risk of the worst kind of medical emergency. The solution isn't complicated. That's what kills me. The thing that could have saved Walter's hand, that could have prevented Dorothy's mini-strokes, that could have kept Robert's wife from worrying, that could have given Margaret many more years of reading mystery novels without fear. It's so simple that when I tell patients, they almost don't believe me. Keep both feet flat on the floor when you sit. That's it. Both feet flat on the floor. It sounds almost ridiculous, doesn't it? After everything I've told you, all the research, all the warnings, all the patient stories, the answer is just sit differently, but that's exactly the point. Sometimes the most powerful changes we can make for our health are the simplest ones. The ones hiding in plain sight, woven so deeply into our daily habits that we never think to question them. Dr. Tanaka's research showed that participants who made this one change, who consciously kept both feet flat on the floor during extended sitting, reduced their elevated stroke risk by 78% within 18 months. 78%, just by changing how they sat. Let me explain why this works. When both feet are flat on the floor, the weight of your body distributes evenly through your hips and thighs. There's no compression of the popliteal artery, no kink in the hose. The blood flows freely from your heart down to your toes, and back up again to your brain. Your cardiovascular system doesn't have to fight against itself. Your heart doesn't have to work overtime to push blood past an obstacle you created. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to push a shopping cart through a grocery store. If the path is clear and straight, it's easy. You barely have to think about it. But if someone keeps putting boxes in your way, you have to push harder. You have to zigzag around obstacles. You get tired faster. Your shopping trip takes longer and wears you out. Your heart feels the same way when blood flow is obstructed. It has to push harder. It gets tired faster. And eventually something breaks down. I want to tell you about Helen Park. She's 70 years old, a retired nurse, which makes her story especially meaningful to me. Helen spent 40 years taking care of other people's health, but she admitted to me that she had neglected her own. She sat through 12-hour shifts, legs crossed under her desk during charting, thinking she was just being comfortable. When she retired, she kept the habit. Book club, legs crossed. Knitting circle, legs crossed. Watching her grandchildren's soccer games from a folding chair. You guessed it, legs crossed. Helen came to me after she started experiencing dizzy spells, not the kind where you stand up too fast, but the kind that would hit her randomly throughout the day, making her grab onto furniture to keep from falling. Her daughter, who is also a nurse, insisted she get checked out. When I explained the research to Helen, when I showed her the studies, something clicked behind her eyes. All those years, she said, shaking her head slowly. All those years I was teaching patients about circulation, about blood pressure, about stroke prevention. And I was doing this to myself every single day. Helen told me about a patient she'd cared for 20 years earlier, a woman named Rose, who'd had a severe stroke. Helen had spent weeks in the rehabilitation unit helping Rose relearn the most basic things: how to hold a spoon, how to button her own shirt, how to write her own name. She remembered how Rose's husband would visit every single day, holding her hand, talking to her about their garden at home, promising they'd plant tomatoes together again next spring. Rose never made it to spring. Helen had carried that memory for 2 decades, never once imagining she was putting herself at risk for the same fate. Helen made the change immediately. Both feet flat on the floor, every time she sat down. She bought a small footrest for her reading chair at home. She adjusted the height of her dining room chairs. She became evangelical about it, telling everyone she knew, everyone she had worked with, everyone at her church and her book club, and her knitting circle. Dr. Harrison, she told me at her 6-month follow-up, the dizzy spells are gone. Completely gone. I feel like myself again. Now I want to be clear about something. Keeping both feet flat on the floor isn't going to guarantee you'll never have a stroke. There are many factors involved in cardiovascular health, things like diet, exercise, genetics, stress, existing conditions. But what I'm telling you is that this one habit, this simple change in how you position your body for the hours you spend sitting every day, can significantly reduce one major risk factor, and that matters. It matters a lot. Think about all the time you spend sitting, at the breakfast table in the morning, in the car driving to appointments, at your desk if you're still working, or at your hobby table if you're retired, on the couch watching television in the evening, in chairs at church, at restaurants, at your grandchildren's school performances. Americans over 50 spend an average of 8 to 10 hours a day sitting. If even half of that time involves crossed legs, that's thousands of hours of compressed blood vessels every year. Let me give you some practical tips for making this change stick. First, pay attention to your furniture. The height of your chair matters more than you might think. When you sit down, your knees should be at roughly a 90-degree angle with your feet resting comfortably flat on the floor. If your chair is too high, consider getting a small footrest. If it's too low, add a firm cushion to raise yourself up. Second, set reminders for yourself. For the first few weeks, your body will naturally try to return to old habits. Consider setting a gentle alarm on your phone every hour or so, just to remind yourself to check your leg position. Third, tell someone about your goal. Having an accountability partner like James and Linda Morrison did makes it much easier to catch yourself when those old habits start creeping back. James and Linda Morrison came to see me together. They were both 65, married for 42 years, retired teachers who did everything as a team. They even had matching health concerns. Both of them had developed high blood pressure over the past decade. Both of them had noticed increasing fatigue. Both of them had been told by various doctors to exercise more and eat better, advice they'd followed faithfully without seeing much improvement. When I observed them in my waiting room before their appointment, I noticed something fascinating. They sat exactly the same way, legs crossed, leaning toward each other, mirroring each other's posture the way long married couples often do. When I brought them back and asked about their sitting habits, they looked at each other and laughed. "We've been sitting next to each other this way for over 40 years, Linda said. "I guess we taught each other bad habits," James added. With that dry humor that retired teachers often develop, I thought it was just what adults did. My parents sat this way. Her parents sat this way. Her parents sat this way. Everyone we knew sat this way. This is what I mean when I say the habit is woven into our culture. We learn it from our parents. We pass it on to our children. We see it in movies and photographs and paintings. The image of the sophisticated person with crossed legs is everywhere. But that sophisticated image could be costing us our health, our independence, our lives. The Morrisons made the change together. They bought new recliners for their living room, ones with proper support that encouraged feet-flat positioning. They started reminding each other throughout the day. James would see Linda cross her legs in the kitchen while having morning coffee, and he'd gently tap his own feet on the floor. Linda would notice James unconsciously crossing his legs during their evening movie, and she'd reach over and touch his knee. After 8 months, their blood pressure numbers started improving for the first time in years. Their energy came back. James told me he felt 10 years younger. Linda said she finally understood why her legs used to ache at night and wondered why she had never connected it to how she sat. Sometimes the solution to a complex problem is so simple that we resist it. Our minds rebel against the idea that something we've done our whole lives, something everyone around us does, something that feels natural and comfortable, could be harmful. But think about all the other things we've learned about health over the years that changed our behavior. We learned that smoking causes cancer, and millions of people quit. We learned that seatbelts save lives, and now we buckle up without thinking. We learned that sunscreen prevents skin damage, and we slather it on before going outside. Each of these changes felt strange at first. Each required breaking an old habit and building a new one. Each saved countless lives. Keeping both feet flat on the floor is the same kind of change. Simple, uncomfortable at first because it's unfamiliar, but potentially life-saving. I want to finish by telling you what happened to Margaret, the retired librarian I mentioned at the beginning. After I explained the research to her, after I showed her the studies and helped her understand why her foot was going numb every night, Margaret went home and rearranged her entire reading nook. She bought an ottoman to support her feet. She adjusted her chair so her knees were at a comfortable 90-degree angle. She put a sticky note on her bookmark that just said both feet down. The first few weeks were hard, she told me. She had to consciously think about something that had been unconscious for decades. Her body wanted to return to the old position. Her legs would start drifting toward each other, but she stuck with it. 3 months later, the numbness was gone. 6 months later, her blood pressure had dropped 12 points without any change in medication. 1 year later, Margaret stood in my office with tears in her eyes and said something I'll never forget. "Dr. Harrison," she said, grabbing my hand the paw. Same way she had that first day. I just got back from my granddaughter's wedding. I danced with my husband for the first time in 5 years. My legs didn't hurt, my feet didn't go numb, I felt like myself again. That's why I'm sharing this with you today. Not because I want to scare you about strokes, not because I want you to feel bad about a habit you've had your whole life, but because I want you to dance at your grandchildren's weddings. I want you to walk in the park with your spouse. I want you to live the full, active, independent life you deserve. The research is clear. The solution is simple. Both feet flat on the floor. Every time you sit down from now on, I want you to think about Margaret. Think about Robert and Dorothy and Walter and Helen and James and Linda. Think about all the patients I've seen over 31 years who wish someone had told them sooner. You know now, and knowing gives you the power to change. It might feel awkward at first. Your body might resist. You might catch yourself crossing your legs a dozen times a day for the first few weeks. That's okay. That's normal. Change takes time. But every time you catch yourself and put both feet back on the floor, you're choosing your health. You're choosing your future. You're choosing more time with the people you love. I've seen what happens when people make this simple change. Blood pressure improves. Energy returns. That constant low-grade fatigue that so many people over 50 accept as normal starts to lift. Circulation improves to the brain, which means clearer thinking, better memory, fewer of those senior moments that aren't really about age at all, but about blood flow. Margaret called me last week. She's 75 now, 3 years since that first conversation in my office. She wanted to tell me that she just finished reading her 500th book since making the change. 500 books, all read with both feet flat on the floor. No numbness, no tingling, no fear. She also told me that her book club has adopted what they call the Margaret Rule. Every meeting starts with everyone putting both feet flat on the floor. They remind each other throughout. They've turned a health practice into a community habit. That's the power of simple changes. They spread, they grow, they protect not just one person but everyone that person touches. And Dorothy, the quilter I told you about earlier, she finished that quilt for her granddaughter Emma. She presented it at the graduation party with steady hands and a full heart. Emma cried when she saw all those memories stitched together, patch by patch. Dorothy told me later that she's already started on another quilt, this time for her grandson who's getting married next year. Both feet flat on the floor, every single stitch. So here's what I'm asking you to do right now, wherever you are. Look down at your legs. Are they crossed? If they are, uncross them. Put both feet flat on the floor. Feel the difference in how your weight distributes. Notice how your circulation might start to improve immediately. Now make a decision. Make a promise to yourself, to your spouse, to your children, to your grandchildren. Promise that from this moment forward, you're going to pay attention to how you sit. You're going to catch yourself when old habits try to return. You're going to choose both feet on the floor. It's the simplest change I've ever asked a patient to make, and based on everything I've seen, everything I've researched, everything I've learned from doctors like Dr. Tanaka and from patients like Margaret, it might just be the most important. Your legs aren't crossed anymore, are they? Good. Keep them that way. Take care of yourself.